Welcome back to Deltora Quest. So you could kind of think of the beginning of this book as kind of the setup for how it's going to go and the childhood of the two main characters giving us background information. But now the real story starts. They meet together as grown-ups inside the castle. Chapter 6, Friends to the Death. With a shaky laugh, Jared bent to raise the kneeling king. Endon, I did not know you either. Get up, for mercy's sake. As he stared, his eyes slowly adjusted to the light, and he thought it was no wonder that he had not recognized his old friend. The slim, solemn boy he had left behind him 7 years ago had become a man. Endon had grown as tall and broad-shouldered as Jared himself. His stiff robes and high collar were encrusted with tiny gems that glittered in the light. His eyes were outlined with black, and his eyelids were colored blue in the palace fashion. His long hair and beard were plaited and twined with gold. He smelt of perfume and spices. To Jared, who had been so long away from the palace and its ways, he made a strange and awesome picture. Jared realized that Endon was staring at him too, and suddenly he became aware of his workman's clothes, his thick boots, his rough beard and untidy hair. He felt clumsy and awkward. To hide this, he turned away. As he did, he at last realized where he was. He was in the chapel. One of the marble tiles that surrounded the raised platform in the center had been pushed aside, and a dark hole gaped where it had lain. The tunnel through the hill is known only to the royal family, and is only to be used in times of great danger, he heard Endon say softly. King Brandon caused it to be made when the King Brandon caused it to be built when the castle was made. My father taught me of it when I was very young, as he had been taught in his time, in words that even a small child can remember. There's a rhyme for entering the palace and a rhyme for leaving it. It's a dark secret. Even the chief advisors have never known of it. Jared did not reply. He had raised his eyes to the platform and seen what was lying there. It was the body of an old woman. Her work-worn hands were folded on her chest. Her wrinkled face was peaceful in the flickering light of the candles that surrounded her. Min, he whispered. His eyes burned with sudden tears as he looked at the old nurse who had cared for him through his childhood. He had not seen her for many years, but he had thought of her often. It was hard to believe she was dead. She had a grown-up son, you know, Endon murmured. He lived in the palace, but I never met him. I asked for him when I heard she had died. They told me he had run away, escaped through the gates during the feast. He was afraid, Jared. Min must have told him what she heard. He knew she had been killed. Killed! Gasped Jared, but Endon's face was twisted with sorrow. She came to me in my chamber. I was about to leave for the feast celebrating my 7 years as king. She was troubled. She had been working in her sewing room, and she had overheard whisperings outside that frightened her. She told me there were enemies within the palace, and that some great evil was to strike this night. He bowed his head. I would not listen to her. I thought she had fallen asleep over her work and dreamed. I smiled at her fears, and I sent her away, and within the hour, she was dead. She had fallen from the top of the stairs to the hall below. They said it was an accident, but you do not think so, Jared finished for him, looking sadly at Min's still pale face. You think she was killed because of what she knew. Yes, said Endon in a low voice. And my wife thinks it too. Jared glanced at him. So you're married too, then, he said. Endon half smiled. That is good that you're married, he murmured politely. I hope you are as happy in your marriage as I am in mine. My wife, the queen, is called Sharn. We had never spoken to each other before our wedding day, as is the rule, but she grows more dear to me with every year that passes. Our first child will be born at summer's end. And ours in early autumn, said Jared. There was a moment's silence as each of them thought of the changes that 7 years had brought. Then Endon looked straight into Jared's eyes. It is good to see you again, my friend, he said softly. I have been cruelly punished for believing you could betray me. I have missed you sorely. And suddenly all the strangeness between them melted away. Jared thrust out his hand and clasped Endon's warmly. Friends to the death we were as boys, and friends to the death we always will be, he said. You must have known this in your heart, Endon, because you sent for me when trouble came. I wish only the summons had been sooner. I fear we have little time. Then Min was right, Endon whispered. There is evil here. There's been evil here for a long time, said Jared, and now both of them swung around, their hands on their swords as they heard the door behind them click open. Endon, it is past dawn, a voice said softly. Sharn, exclaimed Endon. He ran to meet the pretty young woman who was slipping into the chapel. She was as richly robed as he, and her glossy hair was twisted high on her head. There were deep shadows under her eyes, as if she had kept watch all night. She gasped and shrank back as she saw Jared. Do not be afraid, Sharn. It is only Jared, Endon said gently. Jared, you came, she exclaimed, her tired face breaking into a relieved smile. I did, nodded Jared, and I will do what I can to help you fight the trouble that has come to our land. But we must act quickly. We must go at once to the tower so that Endon can reclaim the belt of Deltora. Endon stared at him white-faced. Jared, I cannot. The rule. Forget the rule, Endon, Jared hissed, striding toward the door. I told you this once and you would not listen to me. Do not make this mistake a second time. The belt is Deltora's only protection. The people depend on you to guard it, and I think it's in grave danger. As Endon stood motionless, still hesitating, Sharn put her arm through his. You are the king, Endon, she said quietly. Your duty to Deltora is far greater than your duty to obey the rule. Let us go together to the tower. And at last Endon nodded. Very well, he said. We will go together. They ran up the great stairs, past the first floor, the second and the third, and on towards the tower room. They took care to move quietly, but they saw no one. It was still very early dawn, and though the cooks had begun to move around in the kitchen downstairs, few others in the palace were stirring. By the time they reached the last flight of stairs, Jared had begun to think all was going to be well. He climbed eagerly with Endon and Sharn close behind him. He reached the top and stopped abruptly. The tower room door was gaping open, its 3 gold locks broken. On the floor outside, the 3 guards lay dead where they had fallen, their swords still clutched in their hands. Jared heard a sobbing gasp behind him, then Endon ran past him into the tower room. There was a single anguished cry and silence. Jared's heart seemed to turn over in his chest. Slowly he and Sharn followed the king. The small round room was still, very still, and a foul smell hung in the air. The sky outside the open windows was filled with an angry red light as the newly risen sun glared through a smoldering blanket of cloud. The glass case that sheltered the belt of Deltora had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Endon was on his knees among the glittering fragments. The belt, or what remained of it, lay on the floor in front of him. He picked it up. It hung limply in his hands, a tangled, useless chain of gray steel. Its medallions were torn and twisted. The 7 gems were gone. I bet you knew that. Anything to do with those 7 beasts that were circling the tower in the morning? What is going to happen? Now begins the quest. Yep. Good to talk to you.